Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood at attention in the pristine corridors of the Galactic Defense Academy, her human uniform crisp against the backdrop of alien architecture that seemed to mock her very presence. The walls themselves appeared to shift and whisper, constructed from living crystal that the Valorian architects claimed could read emotions. Today, those crystals pulsed with shades of dismissive purple and condescending gold. Around her, cadets from across the galaxy towered above her modest human frame. The Krillian students, with their chitinous exoskeletons and multiple arms, clicked their mandibles in what she had learned was their version of laughter. The ethereal Zephyrians floated nearby, their translucent forms shimmering with barely concealed amusement. Even the plant-like Verdani rustled their leaves in what could only be described as botanical snickering. "Look at the tiny human," whispered Zektar, a particularly arrogant Krillian whose family held high positions in the Galactic Council. His voice carried the wet, chittering quality of his species, but the universal translator made his mockery crystal clear. How did something so small even qualify for the advanced tactical program? Sarah kept her eyes forward, her jaw set in a line that her drill sergeants back on Earth would have recognized as pure, stubborn determination. She had heard it all before during her 3 years at the Academy. Comments about human weakness, about their short lifespans making them unsuitable for long-term strategic thinking, about their primitive technology and barbaric history. The truth was, humans were the newest species to join the Galactic Federation, having only achieved faster-than-light travel 50 years ago. Every other species in the Academy had millennia of spacefaring experience. The Krillians had been building star empires when humans were still discovering fire. The Zephyrians had mastered energy manipulation before humans had invented the wheel. And here was Sarah, barely 23 years old, standing among beings who might live for centuries or even millennia. "I heard the only reason they let humans into the program was political," added Lyrelai, a Zephyrian whose voice sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. The Federation needed to appear inclusive after the unpleasantness with the Terran integration wars. Sarah's fists clenched almost imperceptibly. The Terran integration wars had been humanity's bloody introduction to galactic politics. Earth had been discovered by the Federation during a period of internal human conflict, and the subsequent integration had been anything but smooth. Humans had fought with a ferocity that had surprised their would-be liberators, using tactics that the galaxy had never seen before: guerrilla warfare, asymmetric strategies, and a willingness to sacrifice everything for victory had marked humanity as simultaneously fascinating and terrifying to their new galactic neighbors. Commander Veltar, the Academy's Valorian tactical instructor, entered the simulation chamber with the fluid grace of his species. His elongated form and 4 arms moved in perfect coordination, and his large, multifaceted eyes took in every detail of the assembled cadets. The Valorians were known throughout the galaxy as master strategists, their battles studied in military academies across 1,000 worlds. "Today, we begin the final examination," Veltar announced, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that made Valorian speech so distinctive. "You will be divided into 2 forces and given a strategic scenario. The engagement will be conducted in full simulation, but the stakes are real. Your performance here will determine your final rankings and your assignments upon graduation." The chamber around them began to shift, the advanced holographic systems creating a detailed star system, complete with planets, asteroids, and space stations. Sarah felt a familiar thrill as she studied the tactical display, her mind already beginning to analyze approach vectors, defensive positions, and supply lines. "The scenario is this," Veltar continued. "The Outer Rim colonies are under attack by a technologically superior force. One team will defend the colonies using the resources of a typical Federation fleet. The other will play the role of the attackers, equipped with advanced weaponry and numerical superiority." Zektar's mandibles clicked with anticipation. As the highest-ranked student in the class, he would undoubtedly be chosen to lead the attacking force. The role was considered more prestigious, requiring aggressive tactics and the coordination of superior resources. The defending force will be led by Veltar's multifaceted eyes seemed to glitter with something. That might have been amusement. "Lieutenant Chen." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt every pair of eyes in the chamber turn toward her, and the living crystal wall suddenly blazed with shocked oranges and disbelieving reds. Several students began to protest immediately. "Commander, surely there's been a mistake?" Zektar chittered, his voice rising to an almost aggressive pitch. "The human has never ranked above the bottom quarter of the class in any tactical exercise. Her species lacks the cognitive complexity for multi-dimensional strategic thinking," added Lyrelai, her musical voice carrying an edge of genuine concern. "This seems unfair to the other students who will be forced to serve under such limited leadership." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that showing emotion only gave her critics more ammunition. Instead, she focused on Commander Veltar, trying to read the alien's expression. "The assignments are final," Veltar stated with quiet authority. "Lieutenant Chen will command the defensive force. Cadet Zektar will lead the attackers. You have 6 hours to prepare your strategies and brief your teams. The simulation begins at 800 tomorrow." As the other students began to disperse, chattering among themselves about the shocking development, Sarah remained at attention. She could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her like a physical force. Every species in the Federation would be watching this exercise, if only to see how spectacularly the human would fail. Commander Veltar approached her as the chamber emptied. "You seem troubled, Lieutenant." "No, sir," Sarah replied crisply. "Just focused on the task ahead." The Valorian's large eyes studied her for a long moment. "Your species has an interesting history, Lieutenant Chen. We have studied your wars, your tactics, your unique approach to conflict resolution. I am curious to see how you will adapt those lessons to modern warfare." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "With respect, sir, I won't be adapting anything. I'll be learning from my team and doing my best to keep those colonies safe." Veltar's head tilted slightly, a gesture that in Valorians indicated either confusion or interest. "Indeed, good luck, Lieutenant. You will need it." As Sarah walked through the academy corridors toward her quarters, she could hear the whispers following her like a wave. The living crystal walls seemed to pulse with anticipation and skepticism in equal measure. Tomorrow, she would face the greatest challenge of her academy career, leading a team that had no faith in her against an opponent who considered her beneath notice. She thought of Earth, of the blue marble hanging in space that had sent her here to represent humanity among the stars. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would not let her species down, even if it meant proving that sometimes the galaxy's expectations were dangerously wrong. Sarah's quarters were sparse by galactic standards, containing only the basic necessities that the Academy provided. Unlike her alien classmates who often decorated their spaces with artifacts from their homeworlds, Sarah had chosen to keep things simple. A single holographic picture of Earth sat on her desk, showing the blue and green world that seemed impossibly small compared to the vast galaxy she now called home. She activated her personal terminal and began reviewing the tactical parameters for tomorrow's exercise. The scenario was challenging. 5 outer rim colonies spread across 3 star systems, each with different strategic values and defensive capabilities. The attacking force would have numerical superiority, better technology, and the advantage of choosing when and where to strike. As she studied the star charts, Sarah's mind began to work in ways that her instructors had never quite understood. While other species approached warfare with rigid doctrines and established patterns, humans had developed something different during their violent history. They called it adaptive thinking, but Sarah knew it was something more primal than that. It was the ability to see warfare not as a chess game with predetermined moves, but as a living, breathing entity that could be shaped and redirected. A soft chime indicated someone at her door. Sarah looked up to see Kethara, a Verdani student whose bark-like skin was currently showing the deep green patterns that indicated curiosity among her people. "May I enter, Lieutenant?" Kethara's voice came through specialized vocal pods that allowed her plant-like species to communicate with oxygen-breathing races. "Of course," Sarah replied, gesturing to the simple chair across from her desk. Kethara settled her root-like lower body into the specially designed furniture. "I wanted to speak with you about tomorrow's exercise. I have been assigned to your defensive force." Sarah nodded. She had received the team assignments an hour ago, and had been both surprised and pleased to see Kethara's name on the list. The Verdani were known for their patience and analytical thinking, traits that could prove valuable in a defensive scenario. "I will not pretend that I understand why Commander Veltar chose you to lead," Kethara continued, her leaves rustling slightly. "Your tactical scores have been adequate, but not exceptional. However, I have observed something in your approach to problems that intrigues me. What's that? Sarah asked, genuinely curious. You think differently. When the rest of us analyze a problem, we follow logical progressions based on established doctrine. You seem to approach challenges from unexpected angles. During the Kepler station exercise last month, your solution was unconventional, but it worked. Sarah remembered that exercise well. The scenario had involved protecting a space station from asteroid impacts while under enemy fire. Most students had focused on either strengthening the station's shields or destroying the incoming asteroids. Sarah had instead suggested moving the station itself, using its own engines and the gravity wells of nearby planets to essentially dance between the threats. Sometimes the unexpected approach is the only one that works, Sarah said simply. Yes, Cathara agreed, her bark patterns shifting to show agreement. This is what intrigues me. Most species in the Federation have been at peace for so long that our military thinking has become institutionalized. We fight the way our ancestors fought, following patterns that have been successful for millennia. But you humans, we fight dirty, Sarah finished with a slight smile. You fight to win, Cathara corrected. There is a difference. I have studied your species' military history as part of my xenobiology courses. The concept of total war is uniquely human, as is your willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. It is simultaneously admirable and terrifying. A second chime at the door interrupted their conversation. This time it was Jorak, a massive Corvani whose crystalline form barely fit through the doorway. The Corvani were living minerals, their silicon-based biology making them incredibly durable but also quite slow in their thinking processes. Lieutenant Chen, Jorak's voice rumbled like grinding stone. I too am assigned to your force. I came to express my concerns. Sarah gestured for him to enter, though there was barely room for his bulk in the small quarters. What concerns, Jorak? My people have served in the Federation military for over 2,000 years, he said slowly, each word carefully considered. We have established protocols for defensive operations. These protocols have been tested in actual combat and proven effective. I worry that unconventional leadership might compromise our effectiveness. Sarah could hear the unspoken criticism in his words. The Corvani were perhaps the most conservative species in the Federation, changing their methods only after centuries of careful consideration. The idea of following a human barely out of adolescence clearly troubled him. I understand your concerns, Sarah replied diplomatically, but perhaps you could help me understand something. These protocols you mention, when were they last tested against an opponent who wasn't also following Federation doctrine? Jorak's crystalline features shifted in what might have been confusion. I do not understand the question. The Federation has been at peace for over 3 centuries, Sarah explained. The last major conflict was the Hegemony War, and that ended before humans even achieved spaceflight. All of our current tactics and strategies have been developed through simulations and exercises against opponents who think the same way we do. Cathara's leaves rustled with sudden understanding. You're suggesting that our tactical doctrines may be incomplete? I'm suggesting that tomorrow's exercise isn't just about defending colonies, Sarah said, her voice gaining confidence. It's about facing an enemy that doesn't play by Federation rules. An enemy that might have spent centuries developing ways to counter our established tactics. Jorak's form seemed to solidify further, a sign of deep concentration among his people. This is a disturbing thought, Lieutenant. You believe our military might be unprepared for actual conflict? I believe that any military force that hasn't faced real opposition for 300 years might have some blind spots, Sarah said carefully. And tomorrow we get to find out what some of those might be. The 3 students sat in silence for a moment, each processing this perspective in their own way. Finally, Cathara spoke up. What do you propose we do about this? Sarah turned back to her tactical display, but now she was looking at it with fresh eyes. We start by throwing out everything we think we know about defensive warfare. Then we figure out what Zektar and his team will expect us to do, and we do something else entirely. That sounds... Jorak paused, searching for the right word. Very dangerous. Good, Sarah replied with a grin that would have been familiar to any human military historian. It was the same expression worn by generals who had faced impossible odds and found ways to turn weakness into strength. Dangerous means unpredictable, And unpredictable means we might actually have a chance. As her teammates left to prepare for the next day, Sarah remained at her desk, staring at the tactical display. But now, instead of seeing fixed positions and established defensive patterns, she was beginning to see possibilities. The colonies weren't just targets to be protected, they were assets to be leveraged. The attacking force's superior numbers weren't just a disadvantage to overcome, they were a weakness to be exploited. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Sarah felt like she might actually belong here. Not because she could match her classmates in traditional thinking, but because she could offer something they couldn't. The hard-learned lessons of a species that had never known the luxury of fighting fair. The simulation chamber buzzed with activity as both teams made their final preparations. Sarah stood before her assembled defensive force, studying the mix of species that would either prove her theories correct or ensure her spectacular failure. Besides Kethara and Jorak, her team included 2 more aliens who had been assigned rather than volunteered. Lieutenant Theiss was a reptilian whose serpentine form and cold-blooded nature made her naturally suited for patience and precision. Her species excelled at long-range planning and had produced some of the Federation's finest logistics officers. The other team member was Cadet Vex, a young Zephyrian whose translucent form flickered with nervous energy. Unlike his confident classmate Lyra Lee, Vex had always been more interested in engineering than combat tactics. "All right, everyone," Sarah began, keeping her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "Before we start planning our defense, I want to understand what each of you brings to this team." Theiss's scaled head tilted slightly. "Lieutenant, surely you reviewed our service records. Standard procedure would be to assign roles based on our established competencies." "I did review your records," Sarah replied. "But I want to hear from you what you think your strengths are, not what some evaluation report says." This request clearly puzzled her team. In Federation military training, roles were typically assigned based on species-typical abilities and formal assessments. Personal input was rarely solicited, especially not from subordinates. Kethara was the first to respond. "My people excel at pattern recognition and long-term analysis. We can often see connections that other species miss, because we experience time differently than most." "Good," Sarah nodded. "Jorak?" The crystalline being's response rumbled slowly. "Corvani are naturally defensive. We can absorb tremendous damage and hold positions indefinitely. My people have never lost a defensive battle." "This?" The reptilian's tongue flicked out briefly before she spoke. Reptilians are patient hunters. We can wait for the perfect moment to strike, and our aim is Prexise." "And Vex?" The young Zephyrian's form stabilized slightly as he focused. I understand energy systems better than most. Zephyrians can sense power flows and disruptions in ways that other species cannot." Sarah smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. "Perfect. Now forget everything you know about defensive tactics." The silence that followed was profound. Jorak's crystalline form actually seemed to crack slightly, a sign of extreme stress among his people. "Lieutenant?" Theiss said carefully. "Perhaps you could clarify that statement?" "Defense, the way the Federation teaches it, is about building strong positions and holding them," Sarah explained, moving to the tactical display. "You create layers of protection, establish kill zones, and force the enemy to come to you on your terms. It's sound doctrine against an opponent who plays by the same rules." She manipulated the display, showing the 5 colonies spread across 3 star systems. "But look at this scenario. We're not just defending fixed positions, we're protecting civilian populations spread across multiple worlds. Traditional defense would have us fortress up on each colony and try to hold them all, which is the logical approach," Theiss observed. "Which is exactly what Zektar expects us to do," Sarah countered. "He's planned his entire strategy around the assumption that we'll follow Federation defensive doctrine. He'll probe our defenses, identify weak points, and systematically overwhelm our positions with superior numbers and firepower." Kethara's leaves rustled thoughtfully. "You're suggesting we abandon the colonies?" "I'm suggesting we redefine what defense means," Sarah said, her voice gaining conviction. What if instead of trying to protect fixed positions, we make the entire star system hostile to the attackers? What if every asteroid, every orbital platform, every civilian ship becomes part of our defensive network? Vex's form flickered with sudden interest. You're talking about distributed defense, but the power coordination requirements would be enormous. That's where you come in, Sarah said, pointing to the young Zephyrian. Can you map the energy flows across all three systems? Find ways to link everything together? I think so. But, Lieutenant, this would require civilian populations to participate directly in military operations. That's against Federation protocols. Sarah turned to address the entire team. Let me ask you something. In all your military training, have you ever studied a conflict where the defender had to protect non-combatants while being outnumbered and outgunned? The team exchanged glances. Theiss was the first to respond. Such scenarios are considered unrealistic. Federation doctrine emphasizes overwhelming force and technological superiority. Exactly, Sarah said. But what if you don't have those advantages? What if you're facing an enemy that's bigger, stronger, and more advanced than you are? Jorak's massive form shifted uncomfortably. Such situations would be inadvisable to engage in. Sometimes you don't get a choice, Sarah replied quietly. Sometimes the fight comes to you whether you want it or not. And when that happens, you either find a way to win with what you have, or you lose everything you're trying to protect. She turned back to the tactical display, her mind racing through possibilities. Cathara, I need you to analyze the patrol patterns Zektar will most likely use. Look for gaps, timing issues, anything we can exploit. Jorak, forget about holding fixed positions. I want you to think about mobile defense. How can we use your people's durability to create moving obstacles that the enemy can't predict or plan around? Theiss, you're going to coordinate our trap network. I want every approach to every colony monitored and prepared for ambush. And Vex, you're going to help me turn this entire star system into one giant weapons platform. The Zephyrian's form flickered rapidly. Lieutenant, that's not possible with our assigned resources. Not with military resources alone, Sarah agreed. But what if we use everything? Civilian power grids, communication networks, industrial facilities, even waste management systems. What if every piece of infrastructure becomes part of our defensive strategy? Cathara's leaves had turned a deep amber color, indicating intense concentration. You're proposing to militarize the entire civilian infrastructure. I'm proposing to defend it by making the attackers pay a price for every meter of space they want to control, Sarah corrected. The Federation teaches clean warfare. Military versus military, minimal civilian impact, surgical strikes. But what if the enemy doesn't care about being clean? Theiss's scales rippled in what her species used to indicate unease. This Saprokuch would be messy. War is messy, Sarah said simply. The Federation has been lucky enough to avoid that reality for 3 centuries, but luck runs out eventually. As her team began to work, Sarah felt a familiar sensation. It was the same feeling she had experienced during her studies of human military history, reading about desperate battles where outnumbered forces had somehow found ways to achieve victory. Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held off an empire. Stalingrad, where an entire city became a fortress. Rorke's Drift, where a handful of soldiers held off thousands. The common thread in all those battles wasn't superior numbers or better technology. It was the willingness to fight unconventionally, to turn weaknesses into strengths, and to make the enemy pay such a high price for victory that winning became indistinguishable from losing. As she watched her team beginning to embrace concepts that went against everything they had been taught, Sarah realized that tomorrow's exercise might prove more than just her own capabilities. It might reveal whether the Federation's military was truly prepared for the realities of warfare, or whether 3 centuries of peace had made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of enemy they were about to face in simulation. The thought should have been terrifying. Instead, Sarah found herself smiling. For the first time since arriving at the academy, she felt like she was about to do something that truly mattered. The simulation began at precisely 800 ship time, with both teams taking their positions in the holographic recreation of the Outer Rim colonies. Sarah found herself standing on the command bridge of the Federation destroyer Vigilant, the flagship of her small defensive fleet. Around her, the bridge hummed with activity as her team members took their assigned positions. Across the star system, Zektar commanded a force nearly twice the size of Sarah's, complete with heavy cruisers, fighter squadrons, and the latest Federation weaponry. The Krillian had spent the previous evening boasting to anyone who would listen about how quickly he would crush the humans' pathetic defense. All stations report ready, Thais announced from the communications console, her serpentine form coiled efficiently around the specialized equipment. The universal translator carried just a hint of her species' natural hiss as she spoke. Sarah studied the tactical display, watching as her unconventional preparations came online. Across 3 star systems, civilian infrastructure had been quietly modified overnight. Industrial facilities had been converted into sensor networks. Communication relays had been reprogrammed to coordinate defensive systems, and civilian ships had been equipped with basic weaponry. "Vex, what's the status on our power grid integration?" Sarah asked. The young Zephyrian's translucent form flickered as he processed data streams that would have overwhelmed most other species. "All systems are connected, Lieutenant. I can redirect power from any source to any destination across the entire network." It's actually quite elegant. Jorak's massive crystalline bulk stood near the tactical station, his mineral composition allowing him to interface directly with the ship's computers in ways that organic species couldn't match. "Enemy forces are moving into the outer system. Initial probes suggest they are following standard Federation attack doctrine." "Perfect," Sarah said, settling into the command chair. "Kethara, begin Phase 1. The Verdani's bark-like fingers moved across her console with deliberate precision. Throughout the star system, seemingly civilian vessels began to transmit false sensor readings. Cargo haulers appeared to be military transports. Orbital platforms masked their true capabilities. And automated mining drones started broadcasting signatures that made them look like armed patrol craft. On the main viewer, they could see Zektar's forces responding exactly as Sarah had predicted. The Krillian commander was deploying his ships in classic Federation formation, preparing to systematically reduce each colony's defenses before moving in for the final assault. "He's taking the bait," Thys observed, her forked tongue flicking out to taste the artificial atmosphere of the bridge. "Enemy forces are dividing to engage our false targets." Sarah nodded, watching as Zektar's superior numbers began to work against him. With targets spread across 3 systems, his concentrated firepower advantage was being diluted as he tried to engage what appeared to be defensive positions throughout the region. "Now comes the interesting part," Sarah murmured. "Jorak, initiate mobile defense pattern Alpha." What happened next would have been impossible under traditional Federation tactics. Instead of holding fixed positions, Sarah's defensive units began to move in seemingly random patterns throughout the star system. But the movements weren't random at all. They were carefully choreographed to create overlapping fields of fire. While constantly changing position, civilian vessels that had appeared helpless suddenly revealed hidden weapon systems. Orbital platforms that looked like simple communication relays began jamming enemy sensors. Even the colonies themselves started to move, using orbital mechanics and gravitational assists to change their positions in ways that disrupted Zektar's carefully planned attack. "Vectors, this is madness," came Zektar's voice over the communication channel, his mandibles clicking with frustration. "They're using civilian assets as military resources. This violates every principle of civilized warfare." Sarah activated her own communication system. "This is Lieutenant Chen to all Federation forces. I remind you that this is a military exercise designed to test our tactical capabilities. The civilian assets in this simulation are part of the scenario. It wasn't technically a lie, though it stretched the truth considerably. Commander Veltar had indeed included civilian assets in the scenario, though the expectation had been that they would remain passive elements to be protected rather than active participants in the defense. "Zektar is adapting," Kethara reported, her leaves rustling with concentration as she analyzed the enemy response patterns. "He's pulling his forces back into concentrated formations." "Good," Sarah replied. "That's exactly what we want him to do. Vex, are you ready for Phase 2? The Zephyrian's form solidified with determination. All power systems are standing by, Lieutenant. Sarah took a deep breath. What she was about to attempt had never been tried before, even in simulation. It required precise timing, perfect coordination, and a willingness to risk everything on a single moment. Execute, she ordered. Across 3 star systems, every piece of connected infrastructure suddenly began working in perfect harmony. Power grids that had been operating independently merged into a single massive network. Communication systems that had been broadcasting false information suddenly became the galaxy's largest sensor array. Industrial facilities that had been producing goods for civilian use began manufacturing weapons and ammunition in real time. But the most spectacular change was in the civilian vessels themselves. Ships that had been scattered throughout the system suddenly began moving with military precision, converging on Zektar's concentrated fleet from dozens of different vectors. Each ship was small and lightly armed compared to military vessels, but there were thousands of them, and they were moving in patterns that made traditional targeting solutions nearly impossible. Impossible! Zektar's voice crackled over the communication system. How are you coordinating so many units? The processing power required would exceed the capacity of any Federation fleet. Sarah smiled as she watched her unconventional tactics unfold. You're thinking like a military commander, Zektar. You're trying to coordinate individual units with a centralized command structure. We're not doing that at all. Then how? The Krillian demanded. We're thinking like an organism, Sarah explained, watching as her distributed network adapted and responded to threats in real time. Every element knows its local objectives and responds to local conditions. The coordination emerges from the system itself rather than being imposed from above. It was a concept that would have been familiar to any student of human military history. Guerrilla warfare, insurgency tactics, and asymmetric strategies all relied on the same principle. When facing a superior conventional force, you don't try to match their strengths. Instead, you force them to fight the kind of battle they're not prepared for. Zektar's fleet, designed for conventional warfare between organized military forces, suddenly found itself trying to swat thousands of gnats that could sting back. His heavy cruisers were powerful enough to destroy any individual civilian vessel with a single shot, but they couldn't target fast enough to deal with the swarm of smaller craft that surrounded them. Enemy fleet is beginning to show stress fractures, Jorak reported in his rumbling voice. Several of their formations are breaking apart as commanders try to engage local threats. Begin targeting their command vessels, Sarah ordered. Let's see how well they coordinate without their leadership. As the battle continued to unfold, Sarah realized that something unprecedented was happening. Her team wasn't just winning, they were demonstrating tactical concepts that could revolutionize how the Federation approached warfare. The implications extended far beyond a simple academy exercise. But first they had to finish what they had started. And Zektar, despite his initial confusion, was beginning to adapt to their unconventional tactics. The tide of battle began to shift as Zektar demonstrated why he had achieved the highest tactical scores in their class. The Krillian commander started adapting to Sarah's unconventional tactics with impressive speed, pulling his scattered forces into tight defensive formations and using concentrated firepower to clear corridors through the swarm of civilian vessels. He's learning, Kithara observed, her amber leaves darkening with concern. Zektar is sacrificing some of his fleet's mobility to create concentrated fire zones. Our civilian vessels can't penetrate those formations. Sarah watched the tactical display as several of her converted cargo haulers were systematically destroyed by Zektar's newly organized defensive screens. The Krillian was proving that even unconventional tactics had their limitations when facing a competent opponent with superior resources. He's also getting angry, Theiss added, monitoring enemy communications. I'm detecting increased aggression in his coordination orders. He's taking our tactics as personally. That observation gave Sarah an idea. Throughout human military history, anger had been both a weapon and a weakness. Angry commanders made mistakes, but they also fought with desperate intensity that could overcome significant disadvantages. Vex, can you create localized power disruptions in his formation? Sarah asked. Nothing permanent, just enough to make their coordination more difficult? The young Zephyrian's form flickered as he processed the request. I can tap into the background energy fields in this region and create interference patterns, but it would affect our systems too. Do it, Sarah ordered. Jorak, prepare for close quarters maneuvering. We're going to take advantage of the confusion. What followed was perhaps the most chaotic space battle ever recorded in Federation simulation history. As Vex's energy disruptions began interfering with both fleets' sensor systems, the engagement devolved from organized tactical maneuvering into something resembling an ancient naval melee. Ships found themselves engaging at point-blank range, with targeting computers struggling to maintain locks through the artificial interference. The advantage shifted back toward Sarah's smaller, more maneuverable vessels, which could respond to local threats faster than Zektar's larger formations could coordinate their responses. This is insane, Zektar's voice crackled through the disrupted communications. You're destroying the technological advantages that make modern warfare possible. No, Sarah replied, guiding her flagship through a complex maneuver that brought them within knife-fighting range of a Krillian heavy cruiser. I'm forcing you to fight on terms where technology isn't the deciding factor. The observation chamber overlooking the simulation had filled with instructors and senior cadets, all watching the unprecedented battle unfold. Commander Veltar stood at the center of the group, his forearms moving in complex patterns as he analyzed the tactical developments. Fascinating, he murmured to his aide, a junior instructor whose species Sarah didn't recognize. The human is systematically negating every advantage that conventional doctrine assumes will be available. Is this legal under Federation military regulations? The aide asked, clearly disturbed by the chaotic nature of the engagement. It's not illegal, Veltar replied thoughtfully. But it's certainly unprecedented. Traditional Federation tactics assume that all combatants will follow established protocols for engagement. This human appears to be operating under entirely different assumptions about the nature of warfare. Back in the simulation, Sarah was discovering that her unconventional approach came with its own costs. Several of her key coordination nodes had been destroyed, and her distributed command structure was beginning to show strain. Without centralized control, some of her civilian vessels were starting to act independently, reducing the overall effectiveness of her strategy. Lieutenant, Jorak reported, his crystalline form showing stress fractures that indicated extreme computational load. Our coordination network is degrading. We're losing the ability to manage complex maneuvers. Sarah nodded grimly. She had known this moment would come. Distributed tactics were incredibly resilient, but they eventually reached a point where the lack of centralized coordination became a critical weakness. Then we shift to Phase 3, she announced, her voice carrying across the bridge with quiet authority. Phase 3? Vex asked, his translucent form flickering with confusion. We only planned for 2 phases. Sarah smiled, and for a moment her expression carried echoes of every human commander who had ever faced impossible odds. Phase 3 is where we stop trying to be clever and start trying to win. She opened a communication channel to all remaining friendly forces throughout the star system. All units, this is Commander Chen. Abandon all defensive positions and converge on my location. We're going to settle this the old-fashioned way. The response was immediate and dramatic. Across 3 star systems, every surviving vessel under Sarah's command began moving toward the center of the engagement zone where her flagship was dueling with Zektar's command formation. It was a desperate gambit that concentrated all her remaining forces for a single decisive engagement. You're committing everything to a single battle, Zektar observed over the communication channel. If you lose here, you lose the entire engagement. That's the idea, Sarah replied simply. Sometimes the only way to win is to make sure that losing isn't an option. What happened next would be studied in military academies throughout the galaxy for generations to come. As Sarah's forces converged on the central battle zone, they didn't arrange themselves in any formation that appeared in Federation tactical manuals. Instead, they created something that could only be described as controlled chaos. Ships moved in seemingly random patterns that somehow managed to provide mutual support without following any discernible organizational structure. Weapon fire came from unexpected angles, with civilian vessels providing covering fire for military units that were engaging targets of opportunity, rather than following coordinated attack plans. It was warfare stripped down to its most fundamental elements, speed, aggression, and the willingness to take risks that more cautious opponents wouldn't consider. And slowly, inevitably, Zektar's superior numbers began to work against him as his own forces got in each other's way, while trying to engage the chaotic swirl of humanity's defenders. "This is madness," Zektar repeated, but now his voice carried a note of something that might have been respect. "Your tactics have no theoretical foundation. They shouldn't work." "They work because they're not tactics," Sarah replied, watching, as another of Zektar's heavy cruisers fell to concentrated fire from a dozen smaller vessels. "They're adaptation, and adaptation beats theory every time when the stakes are high enough." The final phase of the battle was approaching, and Sarah knew that victory was within her grasp, but she also knew that Zektar was too skilled a commander to go down without making her pay dearly for that victory. The simulation chamber filled with an almost religious silence as the final moments of the engagement played out. Sarah's flagship, now bearing multiple battle scars from the prolonged conflict, faced off against Zektar's remaining command vessel in what had become a personal duel between two very different philosophies of warfare. Around them, the star system bore the marks of a battle unlike anything the Federation had seen in 3 centuries. Debris fields marked the locations where both military and civilian vessels had made their final stands. Orbital platforms hung dark and silent, their power drained by Vex's energy manipulation tactics. Even the colonies themselves showed signs of the unconventional warfare that had raged around them. "Final casualty reports," Sarah requested, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that was beginning to set in. "We've lost 63% of our civilian auxiliary vessels," This reported. Her serpentine form coiled tightly around her console. "Military losses stand at 45%. However, enemy losses are at 78% overall." Kithara's leaves rustled with what her species used to express grim satisfaction. "More importantly, all 5 colonies remain intact and under our protection." "The primary objective has been achieved." Sarah nodded, but she felt no sense of celebration. Victory in simulation was one thing, but the real-world implications of what they had just demonstrated were sobering. They had proven that civilian populations could be militarized to resist superior conventional forces, but at a terrible cost in both lives and infrastructure. "Lieutenant Chen," Zektar's voice came over the communication channel, and for the first time since the exercise began, he sounded genuinely respectful. "I formally request permission to withdraw my remaining forces." The statement sent a shock through the observation chamber. In Federation military tradition, requesting withdrawal was tantamount to admitting defeat. For Zektar, who had never lost a tactical exercise in his 3 years at the academy, it represented a fundamental shift in his understanding of warfare. "Permission granted," Sarah replied formally. "Your forces are free to withdraw with honor." As Zektar's remaining ships began their retreat, the simulation's holographic environment started to fade, returning the chamber to its neutral gray walls. Sarah and her team found themselves standing on a simple platform, no longer surrounded by the bridge of a starship, but by the curious and sometimes shocked faces of their fellow cadets. Commander Veltar approached the platform, his forearms moving in what Sarah had learned was a gesture of formal recognition among his people. "Lieutenant Chen, that was most educational." The comment carried layers of meaning that weren't lost on anyone present. Educational was a polite way of saying that the exercise had revealed fundamental problems with current Federation military doctrine. "Sir," Sarah replied, maintaining her formal posture despite feeling like she might collapse from exhaustion. The exercise parameters allowed for unconventional approaches to the tactical problem. "Indeed they did," Veltar agreed. "Perhaps more unconventional than we anticipated." Zektar approached the platform as well, his chitinous form clicking as he moved. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the arrogance that had characterized his earlier comments. "Human," he said, and the word was no longer spoken with disdain. "I have studied warfare for my entire adult life. My people have been warriors for millennia. But today you taught me something I had never considered." "What's that?" Sarah asked. "That there is a difference between fighting wars and winning them," Zektar replied. "Federation doctrine teaches us to fight wars efficiently, with minimal casualties and maximum strategic advantage. But you, You showed us how to win when efficiency isn't an option. The observation was more profound than perhaps even Zektar realized. For 3 centuries, the Federation had enjoyed the luxury of overwhelming technological and numerical superiority in any conflict they faced. Their military doctrine had evolved to emphasize precision, efficiency, and minimal collateral damage because they had never faced an opponent who could force them to choose between victory and their preferred methods of warfare. Commander Veltar, came a voice from the observation chamber. Sarah looked up to see Admiral Korath, the Valorian officer who commanded the entire Galactic Defense Academy. His presence at a cadet exercise was unprecedented, and it suggested that word of Sarah's unconventional tactics had already reached the highest levels of Federation military command. Admiral, Veltar replied, executing a formal salute. I believe we need to discuss the implications of what we've just witnessed, Admiral Korath said, his multifaceted eyes focusing on Sarah. Lieutenant Chen, you will report to my office at 1400 hours. Commander Veltar, I want a full tactical analysis of this exercise on my desk by tomorrow morning. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by her team members. The experience had changed all of them in ways that would take time to fully understand. Lieutenant, Vex said, his translucent form still flickering with residual energy from the massive power manipulations he had performed. What you made us do today? It felt wrong according to everything we've been taught, but it also felt necessary, Jorak finished, his crystalline structure showing the deep blue patterns that indicated philosophical contemplation among his people, as if we were preparing for a kind of conflict that the Federation has forgotten could exist. Kethora's leaves had shifted to a deep purple, indicating complex emotions among her plant-like species. You made us think about warfare as something more than an academic exercise. You made us consider what we would do if everything we had been taught was insufficient. Thais uncoiled from her position, her reptilian grace evident as she moved. The question is, Lieutenant, what happens now? The Federation military will have to respond to what we've demonstrated. Sarah looked around at her team. These alien beings who had trusted her enough to follow her into tactical territory that no Federation force had ever explored. They had proven that unconventional thinking could overcome conventional advantages, but they had also raised questions that the Federation military would struggle to answer. What happens now, Sarah said quietly, is that we find out whether the galaxy is ready for the lessons that humanity learned the hard way. Because if there's one thing that 3 centuries of peace have taught us, it's that peace never lasts forever. As they left the simulation chamber, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their exercise had been more than just an academic demonstration. It felt like a preview of conflicts yet to come, wars that would require the Federation to choose between their comfortable assumptions about civilized warfare and the harsh realities of survival against opponents who didn't share their values. So the young human soldier who had been mocked by her classmates was gone, replaced by someone who had proven that sometimes the galaxy's most dangerous assumptions were the ones about what constituted acceptable ways to fight and win. Admiral Korath's office occupied the highest level of the Academy's central spire, its transparent walls offering a panoramic view of the 3 star systems where the Federation trained its future military leaders. Sarah stood at attention before the Admiral's desk, watching as the elderly Valorian reviewed the tactical reports from her exercise, with movements that spoke of centuries of military experience. Sit, Lieutenant, Admiral Korath said without looking up from his datapad. We have much to discuss. Sarah took the offered chair, noting how the Admiral's forearms continued to work through multiple documents simultaneously. The Valorian's ability to process complex information streams was legendary throughout the galaxy, and watching Admiral Korath work was like watching a master craftsman practice his art. Your exercise yesterday has created quite a stir, the Admiral began, finally setting aside his reports. I've received communications from military commands across the Federation, all wanting to understand what happened in our simulation chamber. Sir? Sarah replied, uncertain how to respond. Lieutenant, do you understand what you've done? Admiral Korath asked, his multifaceted eyes focusing intently on her. You've demonstrated tactical concepts that challenge 3 centuries of Federation military doctrine. More importantly, you've done so in a way that suggests our current approaches to warfare may be fundamentally inadequate. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, Admiral, I was simply trying to complete the exercise parameters as effectively as possible. Indeed, Admiral Korath agreed. And in doing so, you've forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our military preparedness. Tell me, Lieutenant, what do you know about the Devourers? The question seemed to come from nowhere, and Sarah found herself blinking in confusion. Sir, I'm not familiar with that term. Admiral Korath leaned back in his chair, a gesture that among Valorians indicated the beginning of a serious conversation. The Devourers are what we call the force that destroyed the hegemony 300 years ago. The official records describe the conflict as a civil war that tore the hegemony apart from within, but that's not entirely accurate. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The fall of the hegemony was one of the most significant events in galactic history, marking the end of the last major interstellar empire and the beginning of the Federation's current period of peace and prosperity. The truth, Admiral Korath continued, is that the hegemony was destroyed by an external force that fought unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. They used tactics similar to what you demonstrated yesterday, unconventional approaches that turned the hegemony's strengths against them. Sir, are you saying that this force still exists? We don't know, the Admiral replied honestly. They disappeared after the hegemony's collapse, retreating to unknown regions of space. For 3 centuries, we've told ourselves that they're gone, that the threat they represented died with the old empire. But lately there have been concerning reports from our frontier scouts. Admiral Korath activated a holographic display that showed the outer edges of Federation space. Red markers indicated recent incidents, lost scout ships, silent colonies, and unexplained energy signatures that didn't match any known Federation technology. These incidents began appearing 6 months ago, the Admiral explained. At first we attributed them to pirates or equipment malfunctions. But the pattern is becoming increasingly clear. Something is probing our defenses, testing our responses, learning our capabilities. Sarah studied the display, her tactical training automatically analyzing the pattern of incidents. They're mapping our reaction times and response protocols. Exactly, Admiral Korath confirmed. And when our forces do respond, they find evidence of tactics that are familiar. Given yesterday's exercise, the implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. You think they're coming back? I think they never left, Admiral Korath corrected. I think they've been watching us, studying us, waiting for the right moment to continue what they started 3 centuries ago. And yesterday, you demonstrated that the Federation military is completely unprepared for the kind of warfare they practice. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. What do you want me to do, Admiral? I want you to help us prepare, Admiral Korath replied. The tactics you demonstrated yesterday were crude and unrefined, but they showed an understanding of unconventional warfare that no other Federation officer possesses. I'm creating a new division within Fleet Command, a special tactics unit that will develop and implement non-standard approaches to military problems. The Admiral stood and moved to the transparent walls, gazing out at the star systems that represented the Federation's military might. The unit will be small, composed of officers who can think beyond traditional doctrine. You'll have access to resources and authority that would normally require decades of service to obtain. Sir, I'm just a cadet, Sarah protested. Surely there are more qualified officers. Lieutenant, Admiral Korath interrupted, turning back to face her. You are the only officer in the Federation who has successfully demonstrated the ability to defeat superior conventional forces using unconventional tactics. In 3 centuries of peace, that's a skill set that we've allowed to atrophy. You represent our best hope of relearning what we've forgotten. Sarah took a deep breath, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. 3 years of mockery and dismissal from her classmates. 3 years of being treated as a curiosity rather than a serious military officer. Now suddenly, those same qualities that had made her an outsider were being recognized as potentially crucial to the Federation's survival. What about my team? Sarah asked. Cathara, Jorak, Thys, and Vex. They were essential to yesterday's success. They'll be offered positions in the new unit, Admiral Korath confirmed. Though I should warn you, Lieutenant, this assignment comes with significant risks. If the Devourers have returned, your unit will likely be among the first to engage them. The survival rate for such encounters based on historical data is low. Sarah thought about Earth. about the blue world that had sent her to represent humanity among the stars. She thought about the Federation's peaceful worlds, full of beings who had known nothing but prosperity and security for their entire lives. And she thought about what would happen to all of that if the galaxy's past nightmares returned to claim the future. "I accept the assignment, Admiral," Sarah said formally. "When do we begin?" Admiral Korath's expression showed what might have been relief among his species. "Immediately, Commander." "Sir?" Sarah asked, confused by the change in rank. "Your promotion is effective immediately," the Admiral explained. "The new unit requires an officer with command authority." "Congratulations, Commander Chen. You're now the youngest flag officer in Federation history." As Sarah left Admiral Korath's office, her mind raced with the implications of everything she had learned. The exercise that had started as a simple academic challenge had somehow become the foundation for preparing the Federation for a war that might already be beginning. She thought about Zektar's words after the simulation, about the difference between fighting wars and winning them. The Federation had spent 3 centuries learning how to fight wars efficiently and honorably. Now, it seemed, they would need to learn how to win them against an enemy that recognized no such constraints. Walking through the academy corridors one last time, Sarah realized that her classmates' mockery had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding. They had seen her unconventional thinking as a weakness, a sign that humans didn't truly belong among the galaxy's civilized races. But as she prepared to face an enemy that the galaxy's most advanced civilizations had been unable to defeat, Sarah understood that sometimes civilization's greatest strength could also be its greatest vulnerability, and sometimes the qualities that made you an outsider were exactly what was needed to protect everything you cared about. The young soldier who had been mocked for thinking differently was gone. In her place stood Commander Sarah Chen, guardian of a federation that was about to discover whether 3 centuries of peace had prepared them for war or left them fatally unprepared for the darkness that was returning from the void between the stars.